First of all, I'm just going to invite you all to introduce one another and actually just share why on earth you accepted this opportunity to come in and speak to the audience today. Thank you, starting with you.
Me? Chip. Okay, thanks. Keep getting pinged by something in here. Thank you very much, Katie. So I'm Chip Cunliffe. I'm the Senior Director at the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance. It's an organisation that was set up 5 years ago to incentivise investment into nature-based solutions and the ocean. And we do so through the use of different finance and insurance products. That's that's one of the things I'm here to do is to showcase some of the work we're up to. And I think ultimately this kind of forum is in some ways new to the blue or new to blue. And I think this is a really critical piece of our thinking about how do we drive the narrative into different areas and different sort of parts of the net zero world.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Lucy.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Lucy Holmes from WWF US. And we're actually, the reason I'm here is we're actually one of the only oceans teams within the WWF network, which has a country in an office in almost every country that has a specific team dedicated to finance, sustainable finance, both to support the redirection of mainstream finance away from harmful activities that we all know go on in the ocean, have been highlighted in the previous speakers' remarks, but also to support the creation of specific structures that actually try to shepherd capital towards more regenerative, nature-positive, sustainable outcomes for both the ocean but also for the communities that depend on it. Excited to talk about that with you all today.
Thank you, Lucy. Simon.
Yeah, good morning. So I'm Simon Dent, and basically I'm Managing Director and co-founder of Outrigger Impact. And Outrigger Impact is a blue economy fund that is basically looking to make responsible and sustainable investments into SIDS, or big ocean states. We call them bosses. And essentially we are basically putting money and making investments into the transition to an economic and an environmental resilience and sustainability in these islands and more broadly in the blue economy. And so I'm here essentially to tell you a little bit about that and also to help raise money for the fund that we are putting together.
Awesome. Thank you, Simon. Sinali.
Sure. Morning, everyone. Sinali Sirivartana. I'm a partner at Simmons & Simmons. We are a law firm headquartered in London, but very much international in 20 different countries. The reason I'm here is we have lent quite intentionally into blue because for our clients, and we have two key sectors, banking and asset management, it's a real opportunity to find nascent projects, financing opportunities, because you can't really solve for the environment without the ocean, and that awareness, rather sadly, is not yet mainstreamed. And so all these wonderful people are coming together in a collaborative way, and as lawyers, as advisors, we strongly feel that we have a role to play and a part to play in bringing these worlds together. And so that's really the intent of my presence.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sonali. So as you can see, this is really a really special panel, and we encourage you to take a shot of that QR code and submit your questions, which I will get on this iPad, and we're going to hopefully have about 10 minutes at the end of this so that we can have your questions answered. So you can also vote other people's questions up to the top of the list, so please interact with us. So I'm just going to do a little deep dive and ask each of the panelists to share a little bit more about their work. So Chip, you've been instrumental in the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance's work and the Sea Change Impact Fund Impact Financing Facility. But can you share an example of how finance mechanisms are addressing the real barriers at the community level?
Yeah, look, and I think, what's lucky actually is that we all know each other fairly well, and I think we're all complementary in sort of what we're trying to achieve. And Aura has a sort of three ways of working. One is sort of focused on the bottom-up approach of how we drive finance into sort of local communities at a community level, and that's the work that I really lead. Is that local level work. We have sort of missing middle, those organisations or those areas that are probably too big for grant funding but too small for major banks to get involved in. I think that's why Simon is here and can speak to that. And then we have the top-down approach. So really what Nick was saying about how do you drive the millions, if not billions of dollars into the space that's required to really sort of show and to see a change. So a couple of the things that we've been supporting, and we are supported by grant funding from the likes of the UK government, from the government of Canada, previously from the US, but also from philanthropies as well. The kind of things that we're looking to do is really sort of identifying new financial innovations that we believe that are scalable and replicable in and around the world, and we're solely focused on the global south. So as Simon said, small island developing states and coastal least developed countries or emerging economies. So we're working with maybe a couple of examples with an organisation called RARE out of and they have they're based in the US, but they're also based in and around the Philippines, Indonesia, etc. And they've just set up a small-scale fisheries impact bond. And the idea behind that is how you establish 5 managed access areas, ultimately sort of areas that can be utilised to manage access to fisheries or to fish, and the funding model is that it's an outcome-based model. So it's only the UK government has put some money in, and it will only pay out if certain criteria are hit. So number of hectares protected, number of fish biomass, coral reef benefits to coral reefs, etc. So I think that's a $2.3 million fund. So it's not massive. It's looking to leverage another sort of $10 million or so, and we're seeing that as sort of something slightly different in the space. We're also working with an organisation called Blue Alliance, a French organisation, again based out of Philippines, Indonesia, Cabo Verde, and Tanzania, and they've set up a $22 million blended finance facility. And the idea behind that, it really is around, rather than asking and identifying grant funding, every time they're requiring new funds to help support reef positive businesses, and of course the effort that takes to apply for a $500,000 grant or a $1 million grant here or there is huge. And so they've worked with BNP Paribas and ourselves to develop this blended finance facility, which is a $22 million fund. And that is looking to support a million hectares of small-scale fishers and MPAs, and 110,000 people. So, excuse me. So I think it's that kind of sort of innovative financing that's required to really sort of have that impact at that local level. But that's what we're seeing. We are seeing impact at the local level, where people are benefiting from food security, from social security, and from basically adapting to the impacts of climate change.
Gosh, thank you very much. And I think the key part, as you said, is actually driving finance to the local communities and having community benefits as key outcomes, because they're all interdependent. And that brings me on to Lucy. So Lucy, your work at WWF, you're bridging that finance and the conservation directly. And so what practical structures have you seen that successfully support both biodiversity and those community outcomes?
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's great actually to just have lots of examples out there. I hope we're not overwhelming you with too much information, but actually to have a panel talking about really specific, tangible things is actually really nice. So I'm going to give a couple of examples, and then I do think there's some really interesting things going on in the mainstream finance world, which maybe we'll come on to in a little bit, where I would love to sort of touch on that. But yeah, I mean, as I said, we because we have on-the-ground presence in a lot of these countries where biodiversity and communities come together, particularly in the marine environment, there's an opportunity to really bring the finance communities and the biodiversity, nature-related opportunities together. So just to give two tangible examples, for example, in Fiji, where the Great Sea Reef is, that I think all of us have worked on at some point in our career in some way or other, we've actually just put together a GCF proposal, so trying to sort of leverage the public finance there to bring in a substantial capital that actually addresses the market failures in that country, in that system, the economic system, that actually hinder the growth of reef-positive enterprises, both in terms of their lack of access to actually business development support to come up with the business solutions that kind of can address the drivers of degradation on the reef, but also their inability to have access to both early stage capital and then even access to kind of debt finance further down the line. Not because they're not good businesses, but because the ecosystem is just a bit broken. So one of the things we're trying to do there is bring everyone together and try to really scale up that capacity of local business development service providers. And then also to really work with the local financial institutions to help them engage more effectively with the reef positive enterprises and help them understand why the sustainability aspects of their business are actually good for the business as well, not just for the environment. So it's rather than a cost, it's hopefully more of an opportunity. So one of the things we're not actually addressing there, which was a bit of a surprise to us, is trying to facilitate more capital, because there's actually a lot there in the local market and excess in some respects. So it's more about trying to connect the opportunities with that available capital. In Madagascar, which is another highly biodiverse country with huge amounts of mangroves and communities who really depend on those, very climate at risk, but huge opportunity for resilience to be built. That is, as many of you well know, probably an incredibly poor country. So the idea of trying to build anything with major financial institutions is really not a bit of a non-starter at the moment. So one idea that we're sort of working on is to bring together a marine community resilience facility that's sort of a hybrid mechanism that is designed to both support communities through an endowment fund, so grant-based funding that would go to those communities to actually support them to manage the ecosystems and steward the ecosystems in which they live and exist in a financially secure way. But also to kind of support the financial system, again, the existing credit entities to take more risk through a guarantee facility, and then working with a fantastic existing impact fund there called Yeracap that already invests in sort of the terrestrial ag space to kind of help them get more out into the blue space by supporting them with the technical support they need. So again, it's trying to just plug the gaps where the existing system is already there, just needs a bit of kind of organisation and facilitation. Got quite a lot of other examples, but I'm going to stop there in the interest of time, and we'll come back to some of them later.
Thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully the panel will stay around afterwards so you can actually check in with a bit more of these examples. Thank you, Lucy. Simon, you've been leading Outrigger's work on blended finance. So can you walk us through what a successful public-private capital partnership in the blue economy looks like?
Sure. So we just take a step back. I think it's probably useful just to think about the ocean. So the ocean is our biggest natural asset. It's 70% of the planet. It's 50% or more than 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. It's 50% of the food that we eat. And it's at least 50% our carbon sink, so it's taking all, the carbon sink is our largest carbon sink on the planet. It's $1 trillion opportunity. So from an investment perspective, we are looking at investing into the ocean. Today, it's taking something like less than 1% of all development capital is finding its way into the ocean in its various forms in blue economy and in philanthropy and grant. So it's significantly underinvested vis-a-vis the opportunity that we have. But it's hard. Investing in nature broadly is hard. It takes time to make the transition. It takes time to execute on the ground. These are, that we're not building widgets here. We're essentially investing into nature. We're investing into a type of transition, carbon mitigation, carbon adaptation. We're talking about climate resilience for coastal areas. This is not easy stuff. You need good teams, you need good partners, and you need to have an investment structure that works. So essentially with Outrigger Impact, we're putting together a blended finance fund that manages essentially and thinks about the risk that we run in a type of long-term nature-based investment strategy. So we have a junior capital tranche that's generally supported by DFIs, for instance, like the EIB. We have a senior equity tranche, which is supported more with impact foundations and people who have an interest and some knowledge about what we're doing in the ocean. And then above that, we think about a tranche that's more broadly open to private side and institutional investors. So that is a senior debt tranche, note holders tranche. So that's protected by the two junior tranches. So that any loss that's bared by the fund or any particular project would be soaked up first by the junior tranche, so the state-run DFIs, then the senior equity, and essentially the note holder position will be, we hope, secure. And then we also can manage different types of transactions. So we've talked about some examples here, but we look at, for instance, marine protected areas, not necessarily in the Pitcairn, which is essentially protecting what is already there. But if you think about some of the tourist activities in the Caribbean, around the coast there, where essentially there's a lot of conflicting pressure, there's building, there's water pollution, there's tourist activity, there's local stakeholders, there's local fishermen. All of that needs to become under a type of managed scheme, and it needs investment into sustainable activities. And so what Outrigger is looking to do is essentially make investments into the creation of these, call them national parks. We charge management fees and user fees so that the dedicated local managers can manage the various pressures, can invest in pollution, can invest in ecotourism, can invest in management, scientific data and reporting. And that basically you get then a protected ecosystem that everybody can enjoy and use, and that's very important for island-based economies, that you have a type of multi-use structure for what is one of your biggest assets as an island nation, essentially, where ecotourism can be 75% or more of GDP. So this is how we want to structure that, and then we can also take that blended structure and use it actually at the project level. So essentially, Outrigger will always co-invest. We co-invested previously, for instance, with WWF, and they can provide a grant to the project. We can provide either equity or senior debt to the project, and so we actually get a blend at the fund, but also a blended of risk and return at the project level as well. And so that makes it important for investors to be able to reach into nature-based investment and ocean-based investment and pick and choose a little bit about where they actually position themselves.
That's great, thank you. And we've got some amazing questions coming in for the audience. Thank you so much, radical curiosity. But maybe before we go to Sonali, I'm just going to address one now because you're talking about risk, and I think Sonali can also probably contribute into that. But how do we, and this was also a prompt for all of you actually, how do we address the risk perception? So someone is asking, is there a problem with the marketing in financial markets? Is it that it's ill-defined, has too much of a perception of risk? You're talking about outcome payments to try to incentivize in this innovative space because we've got to be innovative because it's just not mainstream. So how do we, how do you see mainstream finance actors' perceptions of risk evolving, and how critical is that if we're to really unleash this at scale?
Shall I have
Yeah, would you want to go for that? Super.
And actually, perhaps I'll weave in the example I had in mind as well. So, blue carbon, can I have a show of hands if anyone's familiar with the concept, so I don't preach to the... Okay, quite a lot, right? So, Simon's already laid the foundation, largest carbon sink, the ocean. So the example I had to share with you is the largest blue carbon project in the world thus far, which was Delta Blue in Pakistan. This was a couple of years ago, 360,000 plus hectares of wetlands. Now, the challenge has been the carbon markets more generally, and VCM, or the voluntary markets in particular, I'm sure you are aware, have run into some headwinds. And that then links quite nicely to the risk-related questions. Because the financial sector and more broadly corporates have somewhat been a little bit burnt in dipping their toe in, excuse the pun, to the carbon markets when there's no real mandatory requirement for them to do so. So for the oceans and blue carbon in particular, given that investment in the space is, let's admit it, that much more difficult than terrestrial investments because it's that much more remote, we have to contend with that. It's really vitally important that we address some of these risk factors head on and kind of go one step further to ensure the credibility factor. So for blue carbon in particular, why we feel it far more optimistic is, firstly, we have the lessons learned from the carbon markets, for better or for worse. And for blue, then why is it any different? So I would cite a couple of reasons. Firstly, in terms of the maturity, so now we have what does a high integrity carbon credit look like? So from ICBCM, etc., there are guidelines that are there that we can build on. Number two, in terms of the demand side, so the science-based targets that our corporates more broadly are embracing, there has been a 102% increase since 2023 of corporates that are signing up to science-based targets, regardless of what we're hearing across the US. So these corporates need a way to offset and to understand how they can decarbonize according to those pathways. And carbon credits, for better or for worse, need to be part of the solution. There's no other way that they could get there by 2050 or indeed 2060. So the demand side is increasing. Now that could be a push and a pull, so the compliance markets will definitely play a role, but increasingly the VCM, the voluntary markets, will come into play because these companies have now made these commitments. That's number two. Number three is, from a sectoral perspective, there has been progress. And I would cite the example of COP, so Article 6 discussions at the recent COP, and hopefully in Brazil that conversation can progress further. Secondly, from a thematic perspective, there are certain sectors who have more exposure to blue, so shipping being a case in point, that are making progress. So you may be aware that the IMO very recently agreed a decarbonization pathway for the shipping sector. It wasn't as ambitious as some of us would have liked, but nevertheless will take the win. So there are certain sectors who are proactively making a commitment to decarbonize their sectors, and carbon credits will be part of that. Number three, I would say, in terms of particular ocean-focused carbon credit opportunities, so mangroves. So Gold Standard, one of the verifying entities, for example, late last year, issued a mangrove-specific methodology. So there is now appreciation that the ocean does hold a very critical solution in terms of carbon credits more generally. And for blue carbon, there is a growing maturity of what that could mean if you are to translate to blue ecosystems, whether that be mangroves, whether that be seagrass. It's not going to happen overnight. But there are lessons learned, and there's a pathway where we can progress this. And the wonderful work that Chip, Lucy, and Simon mentioned, these are individuals, organizations that are in the front line who are trying to make progress. And the finance sector, the clients that we work with, if I may speak on their behalf, because these are conversations that we have all the time, they do have the dry powder that they're looking to invest. So our collective ambition is that we can come together, finding the right projects with credibility, because we don't want to go down the controversial route, and we want to mitigate the risks, Kathy, that you mentioned. But we have every intent and every hope that we can get there. But we need to all be, much like fish. You need to be swimming in the same direction.
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you for answering that and talking more about some of the tools and mechanisms that and the investment opportunities specifically in those coastal areas and in the ocean. I might go slightly off script because we've got some amazing questions coming through, but I wanted to maybe put two to see who wants to answer. One, actually thinking about where this money can actually come from to flow into all of these incredible initiatives you're mentioning. I'd like maybe Chip to talk perhaps to the insurance opportunity here as an indemnity, and to see where you're seeing insurance really playing a vital role, given the risks that there are to particularly coastal communities, and all of us actually, given the dependency on this ecosystem. And then there's another question that I really like, so I really want to highlight it. Should we be placing a financial price on something as, I guess, sacred and spiritual and fundamental as the ocean and nature more broadly? I'd love to get one of your take on that. So first of all, where can this money come from? Insurance.
Can I just flip it and just do the other one?
Yeah, please.
Very briefly, I can do the insurance bit as well. But I think this whole idea of monetising the environment, I think is really critical, and I do understand that there is First Nations people who see the environment as spiritual, as you say, and culturally hugely important. But the way that the markets have been set up as such that actually at the moment we don't integrate the environment into our sort of bottom line, and that's sort of really what needs to happen, because I don't see us necessarily changing the way that we finance and we drive finance into this space. So I think putting a dollar, from my perspective anyway, and maybe for Aura's, putting a dollar figure, it actually makes it quite important, whereby governments and planners and people that can make decisions utilize information that allow them to manage those ecosystems more effectively, because there is a monetary aspect to it. Without that, it's just it's just mangroves, it's just wood, and people go in there and chop it down, etc. So, and it's only used once, and yet of course mangroves are the carbon sequestration, the resilience benefits they provide in reducing coastal erosion and flooding, the importance for them for fisheries. So actually, I think the biodiversity value. So I think if we're able to actually put a dollar figure on, and you're able to actually start to layer those together, then it becomes even more important that those ecosystems are kept intact. So it's all incentivizing the management of those, from my perspective anyway.
Brilliant. I know Sonali wanted to pop in on that.
Yeah, so essentially whoever asked the question, I think that the point is, how do you price the priceless? And the perverse thing about humans is that if no one owns it, there's no value allocated to it. And for the oceans, and this was mentioned, so I was having a conversation with the CSO of MUFG, and they're a Japanese bank, and very interesting and very almost sacred relationship to nature from a cultural perspective. And they said, look, one of the biggest challenges that they've had is that there is no ownership for the oceans and the high seas. So then it's very difficult to enforce and to implement transactions. So this is an inherent challenge now, in the spirit of transparency. These are some of the challenges that we are contending with, particularly on the legal side as well, when we are helping our clients structure these transactions. Now, that being said, I'm going to give you an example of how, and because insurance was mentioned in particular, these topics intertwine. So one of the rather exciting projects that we're working on a pro bono basis this time is we are advising an indigenous community in New Zealand to grant legal personhood to whales. So legal personhood to whales. The Maori have they consider the whales to be their ancestors, so there's almost a sacred relationship there. And what they're trying to do by achieving that is to use market forces to incentivize, if I may use the word, good behavior from the shipping sector. So if a whale has legal personhood and a ship were to strike a whale, there would be a council on land that could bring a claim for and on behalf of the whale. And then that would result in the insurance premiums of the said shipping company going up. So they would therefore be incentivized to invest in the relevant technology needed to avoid whale strikes. So, I mean, it's weird but wonderful, right? And so these are type of ideas, and the intention there, And even for the Maori, and what they've done is they've got a royal declaration amongst the countries of the royal families of Tonga, Tahiti, the Cook Islands, and New Zealand to acknowledge this right of the whale. And what we are helping them with is to draft it into the legal framework of these countries. Now, it will take time, but nevertheless, you can see how, therefore, the shipping sector could be potentially incentivized to look at, okay, what do we now need to do to make sure that we don't fall foul of these requirements? But that's just an example. I wanted to kind of marry the two topics together.
Thank you so much, and it's a really beautiful, exciting example. And back to that merging and blending ancestral ancient wisdom with modern mechanisms, and just please much more of that. Lucy, you wanted to come in, and I also wanted to perhaps you or Simon to answer a question around how do we actually monitor and measure the impact of these investments, which is, again, speaking to this perception of risk, how do we prove that stuff? But Lucy, I know you also wanted to come in after Sonali.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing example, Sonali. That's really lovely. I'd love to hear more about that. But yeah, I think just to kind of merging a couple of themes. One is that, of course, mainstream finance, just to kind of distinguish it, I guess, from the kind of, the blended finance or the more innovative finance sort of on the ground piece, has an enormous role to play, not just in kind of getting involved in some of these structures in a way that works for them, or taking more risk in some ways as well, but in also to understanding the risks of their current investment portfolios, their current lending portfolios. And that's something that we work on quite a lot, to really try to provide that information, guidance, data, support in whatever way is appropriate through principles and guidance predominantly, to actually try to help mainstream banks and investors predominantly to actually update their lending or investing policies so that they are discounting they are going to reward more the more sustainable companies and lend away from those with more harmful activities. So it's not the same as putting a price on nature in the way that we need to do to really value those assets, so that they have a clear reason for protection or incentivization, but to actually make that sort of risk adjustment at a transformational level, so that shipping companies that have less whale strikes will have access to more finance or cheaper finance. So that it's a sort of slightly different way of answering that. And I just wanted to highlight that actually there is a lot of progress there because of things like the TNFD, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but the SBTN, there's a lot of work going into trying to get these big business and finance to understand and manage their risks and impacts. And we have been monitoring, to your second question, I don't think it's exactly what the question is asking, but I'm going to answer it anyway in this way. So we have been looking across like 84 financial institutions policies and monitoring and benchmarking them over the past 3 years to try and see what evolution there is, also to have some kind of benchmark out there, provides a little bit of accountability, but also a way to engage with them because they like to be quite competitive and amongst each other, which is helpful. And we have seen in the past 2 years a substantial growth particularly in the seafood sector, where there's been a lot of advocacy, increased and more strict policies around either exclusions or higher restrictions around some of the key ESG issues within the seafood sector. To the point, I think our current benchmark is about to come out later this year, is that 30% of the banks that we've been monitoring are showing an increase in their understanding of the risks in that particular sector.
Okay. Coming. We've only got a couple minutes left, but I'd love to go to Simon. Maybe more if you're happy to share more about the monitoring the impact, but also the returns.
Yeah, sure. So look, I think we've had some interesting examples from the panel. I think the reality is that to make this transition, we have to invest in nature, and that's going to need private funding. So essentially, we have to mobilize private side funding into these projects, into basically deploying capital to work with nature, and you have to do it responsibly, right? So what we're trying to do is match real responsible funding with nature-based projects. We run a separate type of ESG team, monitor all of our transactions before we make an investment and during investment and at exit. We publish that publicly. We have a set structure of KPIs. I mean, Abigail is in the audience. She's put all this together, and that is something that we report against, and it's what most of our LPs are looking for, both on the environmental side and on the economic side. So essentially we're reporting on both, and it's finance with purpose, and there are structures in the financial community around Article 8 and Article 9 funds where you're 100% sustainable. So Outrigger Impact is a 100% sustainable piece. And we're also here to, on my side, it's the reason I'm here, right? The reason I'm here is to invest into nature in a responsible manner. Then just going back to the whale example, I was going to jump in, but that was such a good example, I couldn't get in the way. But when we're on the ground, and for instance, we speak to like small-scale fishing communities, or even if we speak to local stakeholders around marine protected areas, or even we speak to communities that are faced with, untreated waste and water pollution that is flowing into the ocean and damaging the reefs. These communities are, in general, nearly always looking for solutions. So they're looking for people to come to them and provide them solutions. They know, the fishing communities know, that it's taking them 30% more effort, that they're basically, the cost of ice has gone up. They need to refrigerate their product. They need to get their product to a high income market. They know that they have to do this, and they need some investments and partnership and long-term type of relationships to make all of this work. And so what we're trying to do is really match what local stakeholders are seeking in the communities and build that into a type of real asset investment pipeline.
Super. Thank you. We do need to shortly close. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do a 10-second last statement on why they're so optimistic about investment flowing into the oceans in the next, say, 5 years. But first, I want to ask the audience, if you had $1 million, hands up, who would today come and invest it in the ocean? Phew. Awesome. Thank you. Important than ever. So if you are working for an organization that has $1 million that is looking to invest, one action, people, after today. Just to close, and thank you so much to all of you, number one, for your incredible work, because it is not easy, and number two, for coming here to share it with everyone today. Why are you optimistic?
Because I think I think the panel that shows why we should be optimistic. We got some amazing experts and with real focus on driving finance into this space, which has an amazing returns for opportunities.
$1 trillion opportunity, I heard. Thanks, Lucy.
It's hard to be optimistic all the time at the moment, but I agree with Chip. I think it's because we've all been in this space quite a long time. I think it's much more sophisticated. There's much more understanding of how to actually bring forth kind of opportunities in a way that's good for the environment, good for communities, and there's more than ever, I think, currently, if that continues, capital that's interested in trying to find a way to play a role in that.
Thank you.
I've been in carbon since 2005 and ocean since 2014. Nothing changes overnight. I'm incredibly optimistic. The ocean is where we need to be, and there's lots going on and there's lots to do. And just get on the ride and we can all go paddleboarding together.
Awesome.
Or kite surfing, which
Kite
would be
surfing.
nice. So I would say it's because the conversations are happening. Just last week, I was speaking to a client, 200 million, impact first, their words, not mine. And how they've achieved it? By getting a percentage of allocation from their multi-asset strategy. That's focused on revenue. They say 1% impact first. That 1% is 200 million. With the multi-asset strategy increasing, that could get to $1 billion, right? So there is money. And so it's just a case of bringing it all together. And I remain absolutely optimistic that we can get there.
Me too now. Thank you all very much. Round of applause for the panel, please.